Thank you. So that was a good introduction, and we have a good dynamics of the panelists right here, and I'm super excited, right? So bit of background, bit more background about the panelists, right? As we all know, Alexander is working in UNODC, right? And prior to this, he's actually working at with the Interpol, right? So his views will be very unique, right, from an enforcement perspective, right? And then we have Yaron, who is the CISO of Agoda, and with 15 plus years of experience in cybersecurity domain. And then we have Ken, from a security solutions providers perspective, right? He's working at Rapid7 and he's the platform strategy director, right? So with all these different dynamics we have in the panelists, I believe it's going to be very interesting, right? So let's dive straight in, right? And I think the presentation from Doug Trace about ransomware has given us quite a good insight into ransomware, right? So to really start off, right, let's talk about ransomware, right? Why ransomware is such an attractive tool to cyber criminal, and why is it so difficult to protect against? Let's hear from Alex, right, from the enforcement point of view. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I believe that ransomware it's a very, very attractive tool because it gets the job done. Unfortunately, as we've seen throughout the years, ransomware has been evolving, and actually, ransomware is not a new idea. I mean, it's been in the making for the past 20 plus years, and as we've seen. I believe that there are a few things that made ransomware what is the perfect storm today. So obviously the encryption mechanism. So we have at the moment very strong encryption that it's able to encrypt the data, and then it's virtually impossible for us to decrypt. So the very strong encryption is one of the key elements. But then, of course, I would say the other key element is the payment method. So once we have a payment method that is untraceable or virtually untraceable, then that's when really we started to see ransomware take off. We can see that ransomware has evolved from initially, I would say, the phishing approach, infecting randomly users and hoping that somebody will pay the ransom, to big game hunting, as it's called. So we've seen this transition throughout 2018 and coming towards now, where these ransomware gangs are very well organized, very well equipped, and are hunting for basically one big company that they will pay millions. So that's when we've seen also the transition from relatively small payments to $100, $200, $300 to nowadays what we see in the orders of millions. So I believe that it's very effective because unfortunately it works, and I believe that it's very hard to defend against, because in the end, I mean, if you are one of these big targets, sooner or later, I mean, they have the time and they can just sit and wait, and then as soon as one mistake happens, they can get in. So we've seen that it's very good to prepare and to be aware, but it's also very important to have a plan once you're hit. So I like to also come back to the payment method. I believe that actually this is one of the things that made ransomware turn it into the big threat that it is today. But I also believe that this is where we can actually act and do something. We've seen that actually law enforcement, and we've seen the presentation before, there are tools that can help us trace these transactions, right? And we have the blockchain remembers everything, right? So we're able to trace these transactions. The key element now is to come up with legislation that requires the crypto exchanges to keep data on their customers. And we are seeing that more and more, with the FATF guidelines and with recommendations around the world, we're seeing more and more countries starting to enact such regulation. Some of the work that I'm currently doing in the region in Southeast Asia is we are trying to come up with we are conducting a study on cryptocurrency legislation in Southeast Asia. And further, after the study, we will come up with tailored recommendations for countries and support them to enact such legislation. So actually, that's what I believe can be the key to actually solving the problem as well.
Right, thanks, Alex, for the interesting insights. I think unfortunately, encryption, which is supposed to protect us, has now become a tool and a weapon against us, right? To encrypt our data, and we have no access to it, right? So let's move on to the next thing that has been discussed, right? In the Darktrace presentation, we have heard that they leverage a lot on AI and ML, and today in the market, right, there's a lot of security solution providers that's also talking about AI and ML, how they can give us the advantage over the fight against cyber criminals, so and cyber threats, right? So let's hear what are thoughts about AI and ML in the fight. I guess let's probably start with Ken first.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me today. It's great to join you. We get asked this question at Rapid7 quite a bit about machine learning and AI and how it applies. One of the reasons is because we also have this incorporated into our technology. And as you saw in the Darktrace presentation, all technology is sort of dual use. It can be used by defenders and it can be used by attackers. But let me just sort of explain really briefly how we see it helping, and how we think about it. So maybe that'll help you understand a little bit better about how to discern what you want to do. So if you think about machine learning as just a technique of collecting data, forming models, and then making predictions based on those models, when applied within a repetitive problem space with recurring data, like security events, it can be clarifying. We've heard the terms, a definition of normal, right? But what I'll say is that this clarity is really only as good as the input. A lot of the security events that we see on a day in, day out basis, alerts and notifications and things like that, are context sensitive. They can only really be understood if you have knowledge of the data that is happening around them. And so if your models, whatever models that you're using, haven't been built or calibrated to account for the context around the event that matters to the business or matters to your organization, you're likely to end up with something like a false positive, which at the end of the day, is a really hard problem to solve, because in order to make sure that that's not a false positive, you have to actually have context that sometimes can span silos in your organization. It's not necessarily all in one place. And so that's a problem in that, if your ML or your AI solution isn't necessarily properly scoped, then it might actually complicate resolution. And I'll give you an example. If you have an analyst that doesn't agree with what's coming out of the recommendations, and the model that you're working with is opaque, meaning you can't actually understand why it's recommending what it does, then who is correct? That's where things start to devolve into noise, right? What do I do with this? I actually don't know what to do with this. So maybe I'll just dismiss it or create an exception. And so a couple things to think about. One is that AI and ML are great tools. Like I said, we use them as part of our modern security capabilities, but it's important to know the limitations and the boundaries. And what we use it for example, is a problem space called user behavior, user and entity behavior analytics. That brings together machine learning as well as our own human security expertise to detect and provide guidance around how adversaries are essentially exploiting user accounts in your environment. So we look at network user activity across your network, and if the user, the human, behaves in a way that is unusual, you can see it and investigate it. And we give you the context around that in the context of your to provide context in your investigation. It may be an attack, or it may be a real user, a real employee that presents that risk. But our solution, just like many other machine learning AI solutions, is continuously learning and baselining that healthy regular activity so you can see when it's different. The reason why this is important is because hackers or malicious behavior will sometimes deviate from that norm, and that's where the investigation starts to begin. And so by sort of having this continuously evolving definition, that's how the learning takes place. But in the grand scheme of things, what I wanted to point out is that this is still a fairly narrow application, right? It's not the prediction of everything. We're talking about user behavior and analytics. And it is important though, because we can then provide the context that security teams can say, I actually see that this is this user doing this is normal behavior, okay, move on with my day. And I'll end on the fact that the world is noisy enough without creating more alerts that can't be understood. And so that's just one way to think about what is a common buzzword today.
Right. Thanks for sharing the insights. Right. So, how about Yaron? Have you deployed any AI ML solutions, or have they helped you in your effectiveness against cyber threat protection, things like that?
Yeah, sure. So obviously, all of us is on the defense side are obviously always trying to find, those new technologies or new solutions that bring, a more effective, of our detection, visibility, and eventually, obviously, even the, mitigation part. So we do obviously invest in those solutions as well. But we do need to remember that those solutions are sometimes, needs a lot to train. You always need to continue training the model. You need to understand that is it fit to your company, because the model can be good for X company, but could be different to another company. So you always need to fine tuning to your common, let's say, infrastructure or environment that is more fit for you, right? So it's always something that we need to work for, which is that's probably the cons of it. But without it, it will be very hard, because otherwise I will need to have like probably 50 people that need to look at all the logs and all the data that we are collecting and connect the dots. So we have to use those solutions eventually. It should help us for that, for all the response team. So of course it's part of us, and we're always looking for solutions that will be very accurate, let's say, with less false positive, and of course collecting the relevant data that can actually help us detect the suspicious activity or something that is really happened that we didn't notice, or either of our tools were detected it, right?
Right. So I think, in fact, AI ML definitely has helped us a lot in the fight against cyber threats and cyber criminals. Right. So, so Alex, how about in the enforcement area? Does AI and ML help up a lot?
Well, I can't say that I'm very familiar with the use of the AI and machine learning in law enforcement, to be honest. I believe that as tools come out, law enforcement, of course, is quick to adapt and to use them. I know that, of course, a lot of law enforcement agencies are using latest tools in tracking, for example, transactions on the blockchain in working in these ransomware cases. So to the degree that those tools are using AI and ML, obviously law enforcement is using them. So that, yeah, I think from that perspective, that's what I can say.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think there's AI ML definitely helps us, and but I'm also sure that there are also other ways, right, that we can protect ourselves against ransomware attacks, right? So I mean, traditionally, there's the backup methods of using the 3-2-1 strategy, right? Is that something that we should be looking at, or what other ways of protection or advice can the panelists provide the audience, right? Maybe let's continue on with Alex. Yeah.
Sure. In terms of protection, obviously, I think it all starts with awareness, and I think it's very important to be aware of the risks, and I think it's important to basically spread the awareness within the company, right? We can have, so there are a lot of tools out there, so software and hardware security tools. So of course, it's very important to have all the tools in place and everything working. But I think as long as everybody is aware of the risk, I think that's very important. I believe that the human factor in the end is the one that can cause the security to be in place or not. And then of course I'm sure there are a lot of recommendations out there that our other panelists can provide. But I think the key point is to be aware of the risk. And I believe that looking at various research and materials in the field, I think that unfortunately still not a lot of companies are really aware of the risk. I believe that if you had to face it yourself, you think that this is something that happens to others and not to you. So I think here I would stress that it's very important to raise the awareness on this.
Right. Thanks for that insight. So moving on to Yaron, how about in Agoda, do you guys take in various different kind of methods in the protection against ransomware, or what are the methods that you guys enforce?
Yeah, so first, obviously ransomware is probably one of our biggest risks, as a company that we need to deal with, and we accept it. This is a huge risk we need to invest. So I would say the two major things that you need to take into account for your company are, one is, is kind of be prepared, try to test your environment, from a business resilience perspective, make sure that even if you get ransom, right, you know how to respond and how to recover from it, which is a big importance of this, initiative, because even if you get impact, and obviously it could be just a matter of time, it's a question of how good you are prepared for it, and how, soon you can recover. And hopefully you will not need to pay, the actual ransom. So I guess if the companies understand this risk and they are doing a very good readiness for any ransomware attack that could happen, we can be in a much better situation, if we don't have this, readiness. The other part of it, besides the business resilience, is obviously all this tooling and technologies that we are implementing. We need to make sure that, they have a good, let's say, detection and good visibility, and even protection, of course, to find those, either the different IOCs around there, the intelligence and everything we can get in order to find if we see any, suspicious activity either on, on the machines itself, or either on the user's side, right? So you mentioned also, Alex, before, that obviously phishing is still probably the number one, ransomware, vector that we see. So if you don't have a good protection on your email, you probably will get much more likely by ransom, right? So you obviously need to make sure what are the vectors, the attack surface that are actually relevant to your organization, and you need to make sure you have the right gateways and the right gatekeepers to protect against those attempts, let's say.
Right. So multi-vector approach to ransomware protection, right? And how about Ken, from a service provider, point of view, what are the recommendations in terms of protection against ransomware?
Yeah, I really like what Alex and Yaron had said, and so I'm going to echo a couple points. One is that the whole reason why ransomware is so common is because it gets the job done, right? And so if you are thinking about ransomware as like it's going to get in, and it's not something that is this sort of mythical thing, but it's going to happen just like any attack, because there's many different ways any attack can get in. Then you need to start thinking about preparation. And the way that we like to think about it is before an attack, during attack, and after the attack. And making sure that, Yaron brought a good point, which we probably will talk about, is just like, are you going to pay or not? That's like just one of the things that you need to think about, as part of your plan. You don't really want to be figuring that out when the machines are being encrypted actively, right? And so, workforce education, as Alex had pointed out, attack surface reduction through vulnerability management and understanding where you do have visibility, where you don't. But then also understanding, like, when you're in the incident, when you are in the attack, what is your plan for going about removing the infected systems and using those backups that you want to restore? If you're just figuring that out, that's when I think companies and teams start to struggle and get into the news and things like that. And so I don't want to blather on, because I could probably talk for an hour on this. So I'll just say that's that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that insight as well. So we'll talk about what is ransomware. We'll talk about how to protect against ransomware. So now let's shift a bit to the response portion, right? So I'm pretty sure that our panelists have either seen or either heard of ransomware attacks that are pretty close to them, right? Or probably, like Alex, have probably handled ransomware attacks themselves, right? So in that, is there anything that we can share with the audience, right, on when a ransomware attacks happens, right? What should be the response be, and what they should do. So maybe we can start with Alex first.
Sure. Well, we work quite closely with law enforcement, and we train them and we support them to investigate ransomware attacks. And I think from that perspective of the law enforcement, you really come in after it happened. So it's, you know, more about, of course, finding out who did it and trying to put those guys, you know, where they belong. So I believe that still throughout the region, we need to work more with law enforcement to scale up capabilities in investigating and better understanding this threat. There are, of course, some countries that do better than others, but I think overall we need more capacity in that space. So we're working actually and delivering some training courses and supporting investigators on how really to trace back. But of course, as Yaron has mentioned as well, it's very important to focus on the awareness so that hopefully we have less of those cases to deal with. So in terms of the actual investigations, of course, it requires, you know, all the hard skills that we need, you know, the forensics and the tracing back and all these tools. And of course, the tools are not cheap either. So I mean, to equip a cyber investigation unit with the latest tools, it's quite expensive. So obviously, governments will have challenges in really having all the capabilities in place. So I think, yeah, that's why it's very important to continue focusing on this and of course spreading the awareness, but also providing the technical support and the training for law enforcement in this field.
Right. Thanks from the perspective from enforcement point of view. So now to Yaron, have you ever like handled or seen any ransomware attacks happening, and probably some advice to the audience about what they should do if such cases happen to them?
Yeah, sure. So obviously, I'm sure that most companies, from the defense part, see all these attempts, almost on a daily basis. It's not something new. It's not something unique. So obviously, it's not probably not targeted specifically to them. It's not like a 0 day or any APT that is dedicated. But because it's become very common, we obviously need to make sure we are, have the right protection against all the different, variants. It's like a COVID. We always see new variant come out, and we need to find how to protect against it, right? What's the right vaccine, right? So it's the same, right? It's the same thing. It's just a computer virus, let's call it, which we need to investigate. Even if we are not getting hit by it, we need still to learn from it. We need still to investigate and see how we can be prepared and ready in case we'll be hit by this specific kind, let's say. So as I said, the readiness of us and the investigation, Alex mentioned also the forensics, obviously it's something we need to do regardless we are getting hit by it or not, because it just could be a matter of time. So we have to investigate and make sure our systems and our environment is, can detect it, protect against it, and obviously in the second that it's actually start trying to encrypt, we can, of course, protect against it. So this is one thing that obviously as a company, we have to deal with it all the time. And the second part of it, I would say, is that, a company, or let's say the management, the senior management, needs to understand they need to also be prepared from, from a PR perspective, from a legal perspective to, to report to authorities or like law enforcement, on the geographic that you are working, let's say, to know exactly what's the script you are going to tell, and how much time you have time until report that you have any, let's say, a consumer's breach, assumption. So you have to drill this and be prepared for this script or this specific attack that's going to happen to us, and to make sure that, again, also from a technology perspective, we can recover, but also from, from a management perspective, that the CEO or all of this, they are eventually sign on this stuff, and they need to understand they are have obligation to it and liability on it. So we have to make sure we are prepared and everyone knows his role on this response time, let's say, when this incident is really happening.
Yeah, that's a very good point that Yaron mentioned, right? I think what is very important is to have a cyber response plan, right, or procedure in place, right, and then perform regular exercises, tabletop exercises, so that everyone knows what their role is and what are their responsibilities in each of their roles and in each of the event. Yeah, that's a really good point. That's been brought up, right? Ken, do you have anything to add on to what Alex and Yaron have shared?
Well, at Rapid7, as we are a service provider and a product provider, a technology provider, we have managed detection and response teams that are exposed to these types of incidents and events, like Yaron said, on a daily basis. And we also have a insights, threat intelligence team that not just understands the technology behind the malware and the ransomware, but also the underlying threat actors. And as Alex had talked about earlier, sort of the system and the economy. There's a whole system of even like legal services and support structure for these actors. And so we understand the attackers. But to echo what everybody else has said, I'm going to go back. I'm going to sound like a broken record when I talk about the incident response plan. And this is really a simple concept, but when our team, and this is an example that had come up earlier this year, detects an incident that's happening all the time, you see an Active Directory reconnaissance occurring. You see this activity coming out of a server back out on a port to an IP that you don't recognize, and you see a command that is interrogating Active Directory in a way that you don't expect. Those are the types of things that attackers are doing to learn how to spread the ransomware or spread the threat throughout your environment. And so it's really important in that moment to not just know how to react technically, right, which is the things that a company like Rapid7 helps with. How do you respond? How do you contain? How do you clean up? How do you actually remediate the threat? But then also, as Yaron pointed out, all of the business, as those things escalate, these things become business risks. And so then your legal team and your board, all these things need to be prearranged going forward. And so, as I said earlier, you really don't want to be, you really want to be clear-eyed when everybody else is really running around with their hair on fire, because you need to understand what it is that you want to take on yourself, what capabilities you want to take on yourself. Like you said, like Alex said, you may not have all the money to have all the tools, right? And then where you need to lean on others, whether that's a service provider or whether that's on somebody else, that you want to know that in advance. And of course, the only way to do that is to actually go through that thought exercise. And part of that, one thing I'll point out, and this is something that jumped into my mind earlier, is that when we talk about paying the ransom, you should also understand in your jurisdiction, you may be sanctioned. It may not be legal for you to pay the ransom. So you might want to understand that,
Yeah, well, I think Ken brought up a really good a few points, right? So personally, I've seen companies that they don't have a response plan, right? Or the companies that have a response plan, but they never go through tabletop exercises, so they generally don't know what to do when real things happen, right? And then the other point, which is when ransomware attack happens, it generally become a business issue, right? So that's where I think in the recent years we start to hear about running cybersecurity like it is a business, right? It's not a cost center, but it's a business enabler, right? So I think these are the new terms that we have heard, and it's very relevant with ransomware, right? So which brings me to the last discussion or conversation point that we have, right? In the recent years we have heard quite a lot about cyber insurance, right? And cyber insurance it's not something new, right? But it's gaining traction these days, right? And it's becoming something sort of like a basic and a requirement that any CISO goes to a organization, they'll be asking, do you have a cyber insurance and things like that, right? So does cyber insurance really help with cyber attacks? And is there any recommendation for the audience when it comes to cyber insurance? Maybe let's start with Alex.
Sure. I think that's definitely a great topic, and I believe that with all things, it's very important to have insurance, right? I mean, it helps, right? But again, I think we don't want to rely just on the fact that we do have insurance, right? So I think having that in place should not be something that, hey, we have insurance and then we don't have to focus as much on the security measures. We don't have to. I think both Ken and Yaron have mentioned throughout. I mean, we've all discussed, we all agree essentially, and we all state the same points. Okay, have security measure in place, go through these exercises, and have a plan and know what to do and when to do it. So I think having insurance should not be seen as, you know, you don't need to do all those things. So I think it's very important to have all of that in place. And of course, I guess insurance can help. But at the same time, we know that these criminal groups also do their research, and you know they know if you have the insurance how much you can pay. So then it may make it sometimes harder to really navigate this process, right? Yeah, you have the insurance is up to that amount, so then just give us that. So then you might be put in a position where what do? You just have to pay up because you have the insurance. So I think it's a good point for sure, but you know, we need to have all the other measures in place as well. And as Ken right mentioned, the payment, right? Are you even allowed or able to pay? And you know, exactly that. Those are also very important points that he brought up for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so insurance is something that is good to have, but it's not everything. So I guess we can all agree on that, right? So to Yaron, right, you are working in a Agoda and end user environment. You know, where do you think should insurance benchmarks or be set? Like, you know, how much coverage should the company be looking at and things like that.
Yeah, so obviously, yes, probably most of companies these days start, you know, especially the big companies probably, but you know, that are heavily regulated and stuff like that, probably already have some cyber insurance in place. But you know, it's like every other insurance. You hope you will never get to use it, right? Only in a really, you know, extreme cases. And also, by the way, when you do the insurance, obviously you need to fill out, you know, some, checkbox to see what is the maturity of your cybersecurity, right? Because if it's not good, you will pay a very high, you know, fee. If it's a very good one, so probably you will get a better price for the insurance. So obviously, eventually, we don't want to pay as a company even a lot of money just in case something will happen, right? But as Alex mentioned, and I totally agree, cyber insurance, it's probably good to have, but I would just read I think like a week ago, an article about the cyber insurances are trying to kind of push back to ensure, let's say, ransomware attacks, because they probably, this year, they had probably a very, you know, they had to pay a lot of money, so they probably even lost money, you know, out of it. So they're starting to kind of revise the policies and, you know, make it harder for companies to actually use and get the money back. So obviously, as a company, you know, my, 2 cents to it is obviously never pay the ransom, okay? Because otherwise you probably will get twice or even 3 times because you actually pay. So now they have, you know, more reasons to attack you. So obviously, do not pay as a policy. It's very important, I would say. And of course, on the other hand, you need to make sure you have the right, techniques or the right, let's say, controls in place to, in case you will get hit, that you can recover for it very fast, and you know that the impact of the business will be quite low.
Right, yeah, and I totally agree with what you've mentioned as well. Right. So anything to add on from Ken?
Yeah, no, whenever the topic comes up about insurance, I always, I'm certainly no expert in finance or cyber insurance, but what I do know is that insurance isn't really about, I always try to bring this up, is that insurance isn't really about mitigation as much as it is about transferring. You're transferring the risk that you have to this other entity. And so you're not reducing it. You're just sort of giving yourself a contingency plan. And in the case of cyber insurance, you're giving yourself some a framework and a process and a partner that has some experience in these types of events. But I think, as Yaron had pointed out, just like any insurance, they're going to have some requirements or ask you some questions. And all those things are also the things that we've been talking about, right? Having the plan, having the preparations, having maybe an incident response retainer team, things like that. And so, all these things that we've talked about are sort of in addition to, and then insurance is there to sort of, if we need that additional risk transference, because the costs can be so high for these somewhat, quote unquote, rare events that are becoming more common. That's really what it comes down to. And that's more of like a business risk discussion than, from my perspective as a technologist, that's more of a business risk discussion.
Totally. So, I've come across, these questionnaires for insurance, cyber insurance as well, right? And typically they will ask how matured your security posture is, how often do you do a vulnerability assessment and things like that, right? And the higher your security maturity is, right? Of course, then the lower the premium is, right? Versus if you have nothing in place, then probably they don't even want to take you in as a customer, right? Yeah, so I think it's a very good session, right? We shared a lot of details about ransomware protection and response, right? And we're also close to, the mindful of the time, right? We are also close to 3 p.m., right? So, with so much insight to share, I guess probably it is difficult to digest everything, right? In one shot. So, if there's a one sentence that you can sum up for ransomware protection and response, or key points for takeaway, what would those be? Let's start with Alex.
Well, I'd obviously come back to what we've discussed. So I'd say, just have all the security in place, do the awareness, and of course run these exercises and just be prepared, I think.
Yep. Short and sweet. Yeah. So about Yaron?
Yes, I would say, I would definitely, mark it as, make sure that ransomware is, on top of your security risk as a company, let's say, and make sure you have the right readiness or business resilience in case you will get, hit by it.
All right, thanks, Yaron. About Ken?
Yep. Just work towards your full incident response plan. You're not going to be perfect on your security maturity journey, so at least you'll be prepared, even if you're still installing your defenses. So just work on your plan in parallel.
Right, good. I guess we have all the key takeaways that we have. I hope this is very insightful for everyone. I'm not sure if you have any questions, but back to the host.
Thank you, Mr. Yong, and a big thank you to Ken, Alex, and Yaron for giving your deep insights on ransomware attacks and how can an organization take care of the organization itself if there is a ransomware attack. So thank you for insights. And we do have a question from the audience. And this question comes from John V. Lee. And he asks, when shopping for cyber insurance, what are the key items that are must-have to be included? Mr. Yong, I would request you to please take it forward to the panelists. And
yeah, so I'm not sure if any of our panelists have experience in buying cyber insurance.
Yeah, sure, I can take it. So yeah, obviously, I would say it's a very long process until you, let's say, come to the common ground to agree with the insurance company, what is actually going to happen in case we get hit, and what is actually going to happen, and what's needed from our company to provide them, to prove them, let's say, that we are, can use the insurance, right? Because there is a lot of small letters. So I would definitely say it's probably a legal, someone that have the expertise, and some, let's say, even cyber legal experiment that have the right knowledge about how to make sure that this, insurance will cover everything we want it to cover, right? Because it could be that they are thinking A and we are thinking B and we are not aligned there. So we need to take it. It's a long process. It's not just send me the quote. Yeah, let's run it, and close it. It's probably will take a few months even to agree, because it even goes to the senior management level, to the CEO even. So you have to work with it together, but don't do it alone. Make sure you have the right people with you to close let's say, the contract.
Yeah, I think Yaron shared a pretty good summary on that. So I myself have had a chance to actually do a full round of cyber insurance for my current company, which is StashAway, right? So I'll say, to add on to what Yaron has mentioned, things to look out for will be, if there's an issue, is there a hotline that we can call, and then is there a person that helps to manage the incident, who is on the forensics, panel, right? And then even though they are on the panel, the company still have to have an agreement with, the forensic company, probably sign a $0 retainer to make sure that, when things happen, you don't go through all this paperwork, you can jump straight into forensics and investigation. Then of course, the legal panel, negotiation panel if you need to pay, you know, the ransom, or even your, you know, the media people, right, to help you to handle, you know, the public, you know, and how to respond to them. I think these are some of the things that needs to be looked out for in a cyber insurance. Yeah.